open seat at the city commission level. So this is her last meeting this time. Next Monday, she will be sworn into office as a city commissioner. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I've talked with the mayor, and apparently we've got two openings now, and so the city commission is planning on appointing at least to fill one of the positions Monday evening. One of the finalists for the Third Ward Commission seat was Dr. Joe Taylor, and I believe he will be up for consideration for formal appointment swearing in on Monday evening as well. He's familiar to me. He's formerly with ABC Pediatrics, and it turned out my kids all went to see that practice growing up. So he's been a very strong and steady member of the community, and he wants to serve, as evidenced by his interest for serving on the city commission, and apparently he has accepted an appointment if it is confirmed by the city commission on Monday. So with that, first order of business is the review of the minutes from April 17. It's a planning commission work session. Comments, questions, motion? Motion to approve.
Support.
Motion by Steve, supported by Elena, to approve the minutes of the April 17 meeting. All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Motion carried. Now the minutes for the April 17 regular planning commission meeting. Entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Support.
Motion by Tyler, supported by Steve, to approve the minutes of the April 17 meeting. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Motion carried. Lastly, the May 1 Planning Commission work session minutes. Entertain a motion.
Motion to approve.
Motion by Tyler, supported by Jason, to approve the minutes of May 1. All those in favor, aye? Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is general public comment. This provision is made to encourage expression of questions, concerns regarding non-public hearing items and issues not on the agenda. Speakers are asked to identify themselves by name and address, and a maximum time of 5 minutes per person is requested. Anyone wish to offer any comments on something that's not on the agenda? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move to case number 19-827, 2019 zoning ordinance text amendments. This is a public hearing, and what we generally do is we have a introduction by staff. In this case, Dan Power, our planning director, will give an overview of the, there's as many as 7 amendments to the zoning ordinance that are up for consideration. And he'll make his presentation. Then we have, it's an opportunity for the planning commissioners to ask questions of him. Then we'll open the public hearing, take public comment. And then once the public hearing is closed, then we'll go in open conversation of the deliberations on the various amendments that are under consideration. We'll probably take them at that time one at a time. And with that as an introduction, Dan, if you could provide an introduction to this.
Yeah, and actually I might entertain that I would go through slides specific to each amendment separately. If you want to take action and deliberate separately, I can talk about each of the 7 different items at the beginning of each discussion if you'd like.
Okay.
Now, if you want to, you could open the hearing first, and we could do all that in the hearing portion.
I guess, and how to address that are those that are in the audience, are you acquainted with the ordinance amendments that are under consideration? Okay. So why don't we, it's the best way to do this.
I would just handle the first one, take public comment, and then run through them after that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, do the first one. That's what they're here for. So.
Okay. Why don't we have your introduction on the first one then?
Yeah, thanks for the flexibility there. I know I just kind of pitched that idea. I think it's going to work for the structure of this meeting. And yeah, I think the chair gave a good introduction. The list of ordinances you see here is, there's no particular rhyme or reason to the order, although I think it is good that we're talking about the first item there specific to density first, because I think there's some folks here that would like to hear about that ordinance and talk about it. Otherwise, these were just listed kind of in order of where they show up in the zoning code, so no rhyme or reason. That being said, I'll go through a little bit of background on how we do our ordinance text amendments, at least in terms of our zoning ordinance text amendments. The zoning ordinance is a code that the Planning Commission plays a heavy role in administering alongside staff. So unlike some ordinances related to other city codes, anything from burn permits to police-related issues to other issues, those ordinances typically go through our ordinance committee, which is sort of where things get developed and established, and then right to city commission after legal review. In the case of zoning ordinance text amendments, we still start at ordinance committee, sometimes prompted by a resident concern, sometimes prompted by staff, sometimes prompted by other city officials. We develop ordinances with that committee, bring it to you folks at the Planning Commission, where you might have a work session and then a public hearing, where you kind of vet from your perspective, which is a spatial perspective, how these things will play out in the field and if they're realistic. And then we finally either make a recommendation to go back and work on it some more, all the way back to the ordinance committee level, or recommend a forwarding to the city commission for 2 readings and final adoption. So by design, ordinance amendments are a pretty rigorous process. They go through a lot of steps of review. And here we are tonight after all these ordinances have been reviewed at several occasions with different boards. So with that being said, we're in the public hearing stage for all of these items. They may be kicked around a little bit more, they may be tweaked, but the idea is that we take public comments based on the way these were written up, and we can move ahead with either action or recommendation to continue improving them based on what we hear tonight. So that being said, I will kick off the first item, which those of you who were around on May 1st heard about. A lot of the folks in the audience, maybe everybody in the audience has heard about, and that pertains to the issue of residential density. So here's the announcement. I'm going to frame up my conversation on this one kind of from big picture down to specific issue. When we're talking about density, that's an issue that's difficult to define appropriate levels of density, difficult to lay out the terminology in some cases, and design standards have to be carefully done to make sure that we're using density in the correct and appropriate places. So that's a really big issue related to all residential growth and all existing residential development in the city. So it's something that we're going to have to look at really in depth in the master planning process. Just for an example, Walker is somewhere around 26 square miles and about 25,000 people, many different types of neighborhoods. On this map alone, you can see just 4 kind of screenshots at the same scale of residential development or residential living. And you can see at the northwest corner of town, you have the Winding Stream development, multiple acre lots, single family homes. And then if you're going sort of counterclockwise on that image to the right and then below it also, these are also single family neighborhoods, same scale, different density fabric. And then of course you have multifamily residential housing. In this case, the bottom right image is right near City Hall here, Pine Ridge Apartments to the west. And you can see the different patterns that spring up. And it's going to be important to address where it's appropriate to have different levels of density through the 2040 master plan process. That's a big item that's not going to be worked out in one set of zoning text amendments that we take care of right now. It's a longer discussion that we'll have help diving into with our master plan consultant. So as Frank says in his memo, and I'll repeat here, we will analyze and design future density in Walker based on the neighborhood types that we have as examples and the neighborhood types that we want to establish moving forward as the city continues to grow. That being said, what we have right now is a sort of immediate challenge that we have a term related to density in our zoning ordinance that has no definition elsewhere in the code. So that's always a difficult thing to enforce, and it causes a problem for a planning commission that's trying to find the appropriate way to enforce the code that they have. So in this very specific example from our zoning ordinance, we have a zoning district that's called the Standale Downtown Zoning District. And again, you look at the 25, 26 square miles of the city, this is a very confined area. And even within that area, we're talking about one portion of what's called a regulating plan. So within the zoning district, we have a regulating plan that's got different neighborhood types within that zoning district. So what we see this term in is what's called a neighborhood frontage area, which are the yellow parts of that map on the sort of center lower portion of this image within that Standale Downtown District. In neighborhood frontage areas, we specifically define for townhouses and attached single family and for detached single family this term net density. So it's a very specific situation that we should remedy. No matter what development comes through, it's an item that we need to address moving forward because we found basically a gap in our zoning ordinance, and now we need to fix that. So this is where we get into how density relates to how you build on a specific site. Where gross density is used, what we're talking about with gross density is the entire area of a lot, including rights of way, easements, wetlands, areas that are difficult to build in. And you multiply that acreage or that area by the number of permitted units per acre with the gross density standard. That's the number of units that you can have. Or another way to look at that is that you divide that total acreage by the minimum lot area allowed. So for example, 4 units per acre gross density your minimum, you have 1 unit divided by 0.25 acres of minimum lot area. That gives you your 4 units permitted. It gets a little bit more complicated when you're looking at net density. You're looking at the area that's outside of those buildable portions of the site. And this is something we had good discussion on at the last meeting. What do we lump into that definition? So what is to be considered a buildable area, a non-buildable area? Staff is taking the approach that we want to be comprehensive and thorough in our definition and sort of give a full gamut of things that would restrict building on a site so that we just have the purpose of defining this term up front where it's going to be applied. So this is where we talk about things like steep slope areas, wetlands, easements, rights of way being excluded from that definition. And in the case of net density, if you have a net density standard, what you do is take that area, multiply it by the permitted number of units per acre allowed for a specific use as described in the zoning applicable zoning district. In the example we have of the current zoning ordinance, we only have one of those. It's Standale Downtown District in the neighborhood frontage areas. So you multiply that acreage by the number permitted per acre net density. That's the number of units you're permitted to have, and you design your site accordingly. Another way to look at that is you divide that acreage by the minimum lot area allowed for the specific use, and then that's the number of units you have available on the site, and then you design the site from there. So it's setting up a foundation of what you call your buildable area of your lot, then figuring out the math of how many units you can have on the site, and then working toward design based on those baseline conditions. So I know there's been some healthy conversation about what is included in that buildable lot area definition, and staff is still going to be recommending to take that approach of let's have a exhaustive definition that encompasses everything. And then on the back end, through master planning, we can then figure out if there are places where we don't need to be as rigorous in applying net density, and maybe we can be more creative and give credit for things like steep slopes and other constraining features of a site, or maybe those are places where you rezone the site for a planned unit development where you can have some more flexibility in the zoning. But for right now, we're just trying to define what's a buildable portion of the lot based on the fact that it does exist in the code as a term. The net density term is there, and we need to address it up front. So the recommendation is to, and I don't have the actual language up on the screen here, but the planning commissioners have it, and we can read it verbatim if we want to. But the recommendation is to take those originally provided definitions for total lot area, buildable lot area, net residential density, gross residential density, and move forward with those definitions.
Any questions or comments concerning that? One thing that, as I've read it over, I think the key one to me is the definition of lot in terms of buildable lot area. And let me read that, and after I read that, there's one term that I think is key to this. Buildable lot area is defined as the total lot area minus the area of the pre-existing water bodies, wetlands, floodplains, steep slope areas, public rights-of-way, and easements for sanitary sewer, drainage, water services, electric services, natural gas, telecommunication, or similar restrictions. I think the key term in there is pre-existing. This definition looks at it at before development. What are the restrictions on the property as with these areas taken out? I've mentioned before, acquainted with the Kentwood zoning regulations, and in that case, you're not looking at the pre-existing conditions. You're looking at what is the development proposed at, and how does that, then you start subtracting out, in that case, what the proposed right-of-ways are going to be. So if you've got public roadways that are part of the proposed development, that's taken out of the equation. If you've got public utilities that are part of that development, those easements are subtracted from the lot area. So it's a case where, according to development design, it starts reducing how much you can develop the property. This is a case of taking it before development and saying what the pre-existing conditions are in terms of water bodies, wetlands, floodplains, steep slope areas. I think that's a hard one because you've got to quantify what that means. But public rights-of-way, easements for sanitary sewer, drainage. So if you're taking that out of a pre-existing site, and on examples here, the road right-of-way, there's a utility easement and wetland, that's taken out of the pre-existing, and then you figure out your density based upon what's that area in yellow. If you could use it on some other communities do that, you're making that computation after you see what the development plan is. So arguably this is perhaps a little more reasonable approach because you're taking it in the before conditions, you're not subtracting out improvements that are planned for it thereafter. That may be a very subtle distinction, but I think that's one that makes sense to me, but that's for each of us to decide that as we go forward. Tyler?
I have a problem with starting with the area of pre-existing water bodies, wetland, floodplain, steep slope areas. I don't think that any of those should be in there. You can build around just about anything, and we've seen it done. You can use the natural slopes, natural water bodies, and floodplains as part of your whole plan. I mean, we got to be reasonable here. If I have a big lot, 3/4 of it is wetland, I propose high density residential on the back part, which is zone that, and that's reasonable. All of a sudden, I can't have high density residential on the back part, even though it might fit, because there's wetlands. Well, if it's not going to bother anybody and it's zoned that way, I don't get why we would restrict the natural lay of the land. There's certain things you can't do. You can't fill in a wetland without permission from the DEQ. You're not gonna move a lake. You might wanna use a slope to have walkouts. There may be a nice valley or something that you wanna build around. So I have a problem with the natural things. I don't have so much problem with the easements and stuff, although technically you can put parking in the easements from consumer power, but, so that's kind of where I stand.
Just a quick response. I think that's a really important point. It's also why there needs to be some creativity in the way we write the zoning ordinance to allow for things like cluster development, open space preservation development, which is a specific state of Michigan term where you talk about crediting some additional density or additional home sites based on clustering to preserve natural features. Planned unit development sites may be candidates for using gross density instead of net, or using some density credits. And that's why I think it's important to be really specific about where we apply the term net in the code. I think to Terry's point, this is an exercise in defining the features that pre-exist on the site before design begins, and where net density is required to be the limit for a site.
Yeah, so I have just a couple of comments. One I do think that there needs to be some discussion of the definition of steep slopes, because there is, I mean, to Tyler's point, walkouts, things like that, you can build in a way that complements slopes in certain areas, and to what degree does it become something that we factor in as unbuildable area? Also to Tyler's point, the like consumers easements that you can build under, electricity services being in that definition, I think is questionable in how we apply that to the overall limitations on development. The other one, where we kind of blanket draw in similar restrictions, I guess, is there a way that we can build in some reasonable discretion on the way that we're applying this in every application? I guess that's kind of what I'm looking for.
Correct. Okay, so generally, yeah, I think there should be some reasonableness to where this is applied. Also, I think on the point, that was another good point about the labeling something like a power easement as a non-buildable area. That's just a clear line in the code from having this definition linked to where it matters for the net density calculation. It's not saying that there's going to be some wall put up around a consumer's easement that says you can't build anything there ever. It's just a term that's meant to apply to this net density term that then is used for the calculation of how many units you can have on the site. Doesn't necessarily mean you literally can't build there, even though I know that's the label is buildable. So that's something that I think can be addressed separately, because I think that's a different application. But generally, yeah, I think it's important to talk about that this should be something that's applied flexibly, and that we're careful about not just defaulting to net in our code. And that's certainly not the way the code is written right now.
But in this definition, you're setting it in stone. It says that will be minused out. So.
Where net density is required, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, I mean. I make a motion, we open the public hearing.
Got a motion and support to open the public hearing. All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Those out in the audience, if you have some commentary on the proposal at hand, please come forward and give your name and address and state what your concerns are.
My name's John McCracken. I'm at 4111 Imperial Drive. Just to what Tyler was talking about, I think he said as long as it's not bothering anybody was something that he talked about as far as these definitions are being developed. What if it does? What if this proposal is bothering people? What do we do?
Well, at this point, we're looking at the definition and how it would be
Right.
applied in the ordinance. And if it is adopted as proposed, for example,
Yep.
that kind of lays out what's netted out from the property.
Right.
And so we're trying to figure out, we're deliberating as far as of these factors that are listed here. Are all of them of consequence, and what consequence in terms of how buildable that property is?
Right.
We're not looking, in this case, at a particular project. We're looking
Yep.
at how it would be applied citywide.
Yeah, I understand that, and I can appreciate the flexibility that you're trying to build into it. But if there's a question, to Tyler's point, if it does bother somebody, what do we do?
That would be addressed on a case-by-case basis as it's brought to the planning commission. We would address that at that time.
But right now, the way this is written, I don't know that we've talked about flexibility. Right now, what's here doesn't have that provision in there.
That's my point.
So I guess that flexibility can go both ways in terms of, on a given site, what impact it may have or not have. Any other comments?
Hi, Heather Lewandowski, 4088 Imperial Drive. So I guess I would just ask the Planning Commission, as you work to define net density and what that means for our city as a whole, to the best of your ability to maintain a balanced approach between the need for development, the need for increased revenue, the need and desire that we all have to move Walker forward, and also how we balance that with the impact on residential neighborhoods, wetlands, slopes that may or may not be buildable. I would advocate strongly for the advancement of Walker and the appropriate building of different developments in the city of Walker, but I just ask that you please keep in mind the residents that these are going to inevitably impact and make sure that they fit with the footprint and the overall profile of what you want the city to look like.
Thank you. I think to that end, Dan, if you could kind of tie in what the master planning process is and how that might relate to this issue?
Yeah. Yep. So Walker's looking at the land use that we have and the land use that we want to see and the growth that we want to see over the next 20 years through the Walker 2040 master plan process. One of the things that we're doing in that process is looking at the kind of housing development patterns that we have in place and the kind of housing development patterns that would be appropriate in the context of the city that exists now and how we want it to grow in the future. So that's where I think it's important to look at this and step outside of the specific example of where this terminology lies in our code right now, which is just in this very specific part of Standale, and see that with the help of a master plan consultant, we really want to see where it's appropriate, where we have some unique features that may make more sense to encourage a site to be preserved in a manner that allows maybe a denser development in a different portion of the site or a different area near the site, and where different types of density can apply in different neighborhoods in Walker based on how they tie in with the surrounding fabric. It may be that some of the flatter, more developed portions of the city really should stick to a standard net density terminology, because we're just talking about keeping the form and pattern of development consistent with a number that we expect to see in an area like that. So instead of Putting 10 units on a 5-acre site all in one part of the site might make more sense to spread that out and to keep it a lower density number that looks like a lower density number in terms of form of the buildings and the layout of the site if you have a surrounding area that's kind of that low density residential development pattern. So we're going to be taking an overall look at the city, the existing neighborhoods, how we want to allow residential growth to happen adjacent to them. And that will allow us to plug in where we think net density is appropriate to limit sites based on.
So I think that when you spoke in terms of thinking about what you want to see in the community going forward, that's part of the master planning process is intended to do that. Looking at first the existing neighborhoods and then kind of spanning out from there and what's vacant land, developable land is around them and gauging just, okay, should we continue with the same pattern that's established in the neighborhood that's there and just kind of span out from it? Or are there going to be times where there's going to be a logical break point where maybe there's a body of water that here in one location and you've got your existing neighborhood and maybe that body of water marks a point where it switches to something of a different density or a different use. I think our focus here has been on residential density, but the other factors that come into play are, okay, if you've got commercial areas next to residential, how do you transition from the residential area into the commercial and provide protections or buffers as you make that transition?
I have a follow-up question. Do you want me to go back up?
Please.
So I understand what you're saying in that the master plan is going to help you to better kind of define some of this and what, this looks like. But theoretically, if this definition is pushed through or is voted on today, building could occur prior to the master plan being reevaluated. That would not actually be what was proposed when the master plan was looked at, correct?
Yeah, timing-wise, I think the effort right now is to... Thank you. Timing-wise, the effort now is to fill the void with we've got a term here that doesn't have a definition. So that's the immediate thing we're looking at. But you're right, in terms of as we go forward, how it's master planned will have a bearing on how it's applied.
But the master plan will come after this definition is set. So any building prior to the master plan being reevaluated, even if when the master plan is looked at again with the consultant, it wouldn't have then fit the goal, it's going to be too late, essentially. So back to my original point, please then keep in mind that I think it's really important that you're looking at the master plan. I think that that is a good thing that you're doing. Seems like it's needed, but the decisions you make today are going to have implications on potential building structures prior to the master plan being looked at.
Well, I guess one, in response to that, it's not like we don't have a master plan in place right now.
Correct.
So we have master planning in place, we've got some existing zoning, and you're right, under the existing zoning, there are rights and rules right now. This is going to refine and define a rule that's a little bit unclear right now.
Mm-hmm. And to Dan's point, it sounds like this is really focused on a very small area of the downtown development district that this term is going to likely be applied to, correct?
Well, right now, it's restricted just to the Standale area. But it could have implications as we go through the master planning process to have more effect on a greater portion of the community.
So then I guess my just last, which I've already stated, but my last point would be, please, as you make a decision on this, keep in mind that the master plan has not been reevaluated yet. And so the impact of what you all decide is going to be felt by people who are going to be affected by this development who didn't have a chance for the master plan to be relooked at. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the audience this evening?
John McCracken from 4111 Imperial again. just to my neighbor's point here, I think we're talking about grandfathering things. And I think that we pointed out we've got a hole in this definition. And I think that as we move forward and on a case-by-case basis, we really should open up these areas that are prone to be, I guess, debated to public comment, and that be taken into consideration prior to this new master plan being developed. Thanks.
Thank you.
Tim Allsbach, 4055 Bull Rush, just south of Lake Michigan Drive in Cummings. Thanks for listening to us tonight. I was just referring to Mr. Wash's memo to the commission tonight, as it talks about the purpose of this is to talk about lot density, residential, et cetera, as it relates to this specific SDD zone, in particular the neighborhood-only residential development. On his first page, he has a term called buildable lot area, and I think that's a term that's used throughout in this ordinance adoption. And I think just a term that may be a little more broad scope and a little more definite would be developable area. Typically, when you use the term buildable, it's above ground. A lot of sites that are developed, there are criteria within the zoning ordinance, not only in the SDD, but everywhere in Walker that talks about open space, preservation of woodland, areas of needed for park area for the residents of a particular group, in this case an apartment complex that would be in an area or townhomes. So it really starts talking about larger areas, detention ponds that would be a part of a developable area that's not considered really buildable in the broad sense of construction above ground. So I just think that we need to be looking at that term when we say buildable, that it's all inclusive of a site development, which includes other criteria. Then on his last page, he says, just keep in mind, and again, we talked about this, the code amendments will also be set the foundation for upcoming density discussion. So this is specific for tonight, but it's going to set the ground rules for the rest of Walker. So I think what develops here in conversation really is going to carry forward to the rest of this discussion with master planning. So I think we need to get this right. Again, looking at the ordinance that's being set forth, using the terms buildable, it's my thought that maybe that term buildable changes to developable because, again, you got so many aspects of a developable site. And then Dan had put together some schematics that he had shown, they're up on the thing right now, about the total and net area. In both these graphics, they show a roadway. Parallel with that is a utility easement, general building area, and then a wetland. So I think typically when you think of this utility area along a roadway, that's your standard 10 foot to 15 foot that parallels, that's running all public utilities. The term public, I think, is key here. That's your gas, electric, phone, internet, TV, telephone, and all for public access. And that is, again, something that it's got a specific term when it talks about public. And then looking at the new proposed documents, there seems to be just a little bit of a change in wording from the work session that happened on May 1. All the terms are in place, but the term public was taken out in front of the word for utilities. And I think that there's a key definition that we have to apply here, the difference between a public and a private utility. Again, anytime you have an area that's set up for all utilities, which are public owned companies, that's a factor that makes sense. That goes right along with public right-of-ways, both hand in hand. The second one, when you start using the term private, which are consumers' energy easements, which are private entities. That includes overhead lines, it includes underground, et cetera. There's a number of developments that have occurred recently that if you do not count the overhead line of putting a parking lot underneath it, then that becomes an area of undevelopable, so you're minimizing the ability of a developer to use his full property as allowed by Consumers Energy. The townhomes that are just down, just south on Cummings, same thing. There's a future development coming that will have this retail on the main and residential above. There is power lines that go over the top. If we start eliminating that area of a buildable area, then where's parking going to go? So my point is that when you deal with a term of private easements, not just the term easements, I think that has to be helped added to this definition, because Consumers does allow for development of parking in there. You can have parks underneath there, things that align with what the zoning ordinance, in particular SDD, talks about. I know we're trying to get at a density number by net, but I think I need to remind the commission, if they haven't looked through the SDD zone, in particular the studies that have been done in the Downtown Development Authority, there was a amendment that was done in 2007 that went specifically in the areas, and they talked about the kind of development that they want to see in these feeder areas of what we're talking about, and this is SDD. Of course, this one is neighborhood and residential only, and they specifically talk about higher densities, college students that are going to help feed the downtown development businesses. They talk about areas of things of making sure that you have access by walkways, public bicycle lanes and things to be able to get to downtown, and they're specifically set up because of their proximity to downtown that it's a walkable area to the businesses that are within the Lake Michigan corridor. So I think it's, again, looking at the SDD zone with this specific piece of property, I think, and the other zones that could impact, be impacted on Kinney and coming south, that again, there's specific language in there that they're looking for higher density to help feed the DDA's businesses and help promote that program. So again, I think just referring to that term, I guess in my opinion, I think easements are good. The other issue is the wetlands. There are a number of issues, as we all know, as you get into development, there are fewer and fewer quality, we'd say, developable sites. Wetlands can be mitigated. So I think to include terms of wetland is going to keep the ability for some sites to be developed. If it says wetland, you can't touch it. Well, you can mitigate them. You can use them as features. You can use them as a detention area, first flushes. So next thing you know, that's not part of an overall developed area. And that may not be specific with this particular SDD zone, but in the future, if this is the roadmap, we're going to run into some issues there. And I agree with the ravines, steep slopes. Those are actually quality features you can use for walkouts and other things like that. Other easements, sanitary, storm, all that, even in single-family residential, you can use those for play areas. You can't build over them, you can't put fences on them, but you can have structures on them of movable type so that you can have picnic tables, you can have all this stuff, and you start excluding that, even in single-family home areas where storm are running between easements of property owners. You're restricting a lot of usable area that I think individuals would want. So thanks for listening, and I think that hits my list. Thanks.
Any other comments? Now, well,
Need a motion to close the public.
yes.
Motion to close.
Support.
Motion and support. A motion by Jason, supported by Elena, to close the public hearing. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Conversation.
So, in regards to this, I'm pretty much against this whole thing. I do not like it at all. And I think that there's a couple things that are going on here for two reasons. One, I don't like the language where the only thing I like in there is the pre-existing water bodies. all the rest of them I don't care for at all. I think it limits how people are looking at the lots and what you can do with them. And I think that we want to let the development kind of decide how the best way to go is with that, and then bring it to us to get an approval on that. I think this is putting us into a position where it's already restricting it. The second part of that is I think by making these changes, we're essentially taking lots that are out there now that are good buildable and or developable lots, and we're making them a lot less attractive. And that hurts people that are trying to sell them. That hurts people that are trying to do something with them. To me, this one, it doesn't make sense for me. And I feel like it's being rushed in for one particular thing, and we don't necessarily need to. We can do a better job at this. There's this definition can be done, but it needs to be done with a little bit more thought as to what it does with everything. And I just think it's way too restrictive in this manner. So that's my opinion. I'm a no vote on this.
Rather than repeat what Jason said, I'll just say ditto.
Not to put anybody on any spot, but any comments, Mark, you want to offer, Elena?
I'll offer it. I think it needs to be worked a little more. So developable versus buildable, I think that's worth someone looking at it deeper than just, proposing a change here or, so I think it'd be good to consider it.
Okay.
I think we're better off tabling it for further discussion to figure out the language requirements that we want to have for what we want for the net to be defined as.
Okay, thank you. Pat?
I know what the goal was on this, was to try to make it so that we'd look at every site and then we'd say, okay, it meets these, and now we could give a little bit of leeway after they come in and start talking about it. But like Jason said, we may lose people to actually build on lots because it's so strict. They may say, no, I don't want that one. Oh, they'll go somewhere else. If we make it a little bit more loose, we'll get them in here, and then we can kind of push some of these issues like we do today. So I agree. I think we should, scratch this or look at it a little bit more and maybe make it more broad than what it is today. I think it's too much.
Okay, I'm,
You don't want Steve to say anything?
oh, Steve.
No, no, you're fine. You're fine. I was just gonna go ahead and make a motion to table for now,
Okay,
because I think that I'm getting a consensus feel from the commission that at very least we need to have a more thorough discussion about what we're building in and what else needs to be done in terms of refining this definition.
okay. And I'm sensing that that's the direction we're going. But I think to be helpful to staff as well as ultimately the city commission, I sense that as people were giving their comments, steep slope was one of those terms that there's some discomfort with. And I don't know, I think, Jason, from what you're saying, everything except for the water bodies, existing water bodies.
Yeah, I think you can make an argument with each and every one of these that they could be used as a way to look at your total net area. The water bodies I can understand because you're just really not going to do anything with that. But every one of the other ones, something can change. Even public utilities can be changed. You just have to pay for it. So I just don't care for this. And then even at the end, it just says, or similar restrictions. Who defines what those restrictions are? It's way too tight. And if I take off a commissioner hat and put a developer hat on, or any other hat, I would look at this and go, oh, they're getting really tight in what they are going to allow, and maybe we just look elsewhere. And we don't want that to happen. I would rather see somebody that comes in with a creative plan, and then we look at it here as to whether or not it has merit or doesn't have merit.
Tyler?
Can I make a motion?
Can I ask for some
No.
clarification before there's a motion? That's okay? Yes, no?
Yes.
Let's call, okay. I think we need help steering the ship from a staff standpoint. What I'm hearing most of the issues are with is the idea of net density. It's the idea of limiting creative development on a site by using this terminology. But I just want to keep in mind, there's still a limited application of that term in the existing ordinance, and the opportunity to not use to use that term as little as we want to moving forward on constrained sites. I think that's the thing that we need to understand. Are we talking about really being careful about where we regulate based on net density, or are we talking about having a lenient standard for net density? So I think we really need to know, and that's a discussion I think we're going to need help with moving forward. And I think the master plan process will inform that, but I think staff needs to know which way to go with this ordinance, so we can fill this gap that we have in the code right now as well.
I would recommend that the ordinance committee listen to this, what just went on here. A lot was said here, and I think that a lot of good things were said here, and it would form that, in my opinion.
So to that end, I think it would make sense to re-refer to the ordinance committee, because I think there does have to be a secondary discussion that's more thorough. And to the point of Tyler referring to this discussion, both our planning commission chair and vice chair are invited to those meetings. So we would love to see you there to have some more thorough discussion on the subject, and help guide the way that we talk about that, because I will be there, but having more context for the folks who weren't here is always helpful.
So your motion is?
I make a motion that we deny, not just table, but deny it as written, with the instruction to go back to the ordinance committee with the notes that have been said here and input from the planning commission.
I'll support that.
So we've got a motion on the floor and support, motion by Tyler, supported by Jason, to recommend denial of the proposed language. And are we talking about that we've got gross, now that which is in blue on what we have before us, is that a draft language, all draft language?
All draft, and I do apologize, there were a couple of changes based on the red lines that I had just not brought into the last set. So the word public was removed from easements, because it didn't make sense to call electricity services natural gas public easements. And the steep slope areas was a change from the word ravine previously. Okay. So any rate, the blue text that you see is the draft, the working draft.
Okay, so when we recommend denial, we're recommending denial of all of it?
Yep.
Okay.
Go back to the drawing board, because you can't get net from anything that's said here.
Okay.
So gross is fine, but that's what we're already following, is gross in the current ordinance.
Okay.
Just keep in mind the administrative aspect of this. I'm the zoning administrator. If there is a project proposed on a site where net is used as a term, I'm going to default back to best practices, definitions that we find from comparison communities. And I think there's a lot of work that went into this definition, so may come down to an interpretation of the terminology, which would kick to Zoning Board of Appeals. That's a decision tree on, I'm not sure if the project that's been recently reviewed is even going to be a project site that we're looking at in those terms, or it's another project. But just if that does come up, if we don't have an ordinance in place to address it, there's going to have to be some interpretation.
Like we're currently doing.
Sure, yeah, but ZBA or staff will have to work through that with whoever's applying.
But we already have a definition here of buildable lot. So that,
We don't.
it's right here, it's net residential density buildable lot, not there on the first page. In the blue.
In the blue, that's
That's
draft.
proposed.
That's
I know it's proposed,
Yeah.
but I mean, that is, I'm okay with those two. I'm not okay with the second page, but
Well, and so, that's why I wanted to clarify, so the motion maker is saying, for all the,
I can amend the motion to say we need better definitions
so,
as a whole.
So do we run into any problems with doing a denial rather than a tabling, as far as revisiting this at ordinance level? Or is that the right way to do it to get it back to that step?
You know, I suppose I'd still say that what we're addressing is definitions related to lot area and residential density. If the planning commission agrees we still need to make those definitions, I still consider this an open, active review, and we can call it a tabling, even if you want to fundamentally go back to the drawing board. We're still reviewing the same concept. So I guess I'd recommend calling it a tabling, just so we don't start the noticing over again.
I'll amend my motion. I'll amend my motion to tabling. Jason?
Yeah, I'm thinking.
I'll support the tabling.
well,
Yeah.
okay. So, we've got a motion on the floor to table action on this and send it back to the city commission
No.
and the
The ordinance.
Ordinance committee.
ordinance committee, I'm sorry, ordinance committee,
Couldn't
thank you.
think of it either.
Is that understood by everybody then? That being the case, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. So it's tabled, so it will go back to the City Commission Ordinance Committee for further conversation. We appreciate your commentary, all those that have offered it, and please keep an eye open as we go through. As this goes through, if it comes back to the Planning Commission again, will that be under a public hearing?
I think it depends on how much everything changes and how soon it is. If it's not within the next maybe 60 days, I'd probably renotice as a new public hearing. Otherwise, we could say we'll pick this up again and remove it from the table within the next 60 days of Planning Commission meeting cycle. So to watch the agenda for when it's back up.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. The next item, Dan, if you could look at the mobile food vendors.
Yeah, my ultimate recommendation here, and I don't like to jump the gun, is going to be to table only because the ordinance committee asked for a full ordinance to be reviewed for mobile food vending, and I didn't have that ready. So I wanted to keep the conversation going. I think it's valid to get public comments on this if we have anybody interested. But we still have to run the ordinance text through the ordinance committee, so I want to recommend a tabling to do that. But just to quickly run down, I guess I'll just show this example. For any given site, what we were talking about at the work session and with the ordinance committee was an ordinance that had registration for individual mobile food vendors, so individual trucks or barbecue pits, and those registration forms would have verification that you have active health department licensure, verification that the fire department has reviewed your equipment. This would be done annually and filed in the community development department office. On top of the registration forms for these individual vendors, you would have a application process for the site that wants to host this stuff. So that would be done through temporary use permit application process once a year. Might be something along the lines of what you see for the farmers market at the corner of Lake Michigan Drive in Wilson, or that has been there. That's saying something like 1 or 2 days a week from April to October, we'll have 1 or 2 mobile food vendors on site. So that's the structure of the draft ordinance that's proposed. I invite conversation about that. I know there was some at the work session. You can open and close the public hearing if you want, and then, or we defer that whole thing until one of the next few meetings as well. But the ordinance committee will look at an ordinance for this before we take action here.
Anybody want to give any comment on that? I have one.
Sure.
On page 17, you've got a bullet that says must be an accessory temporary use to a principal use on the same lot.